Hello everybody, is everyone alright? I'm alright. I'd like to talk about some books again. At the end of January I did this big, massive video about all the books that I read in 2019 and catching up with classic books and all that. I really liked making that video and I didn't want to wait another year to make another one, so I thought, well, I'll just make another one now. So there. So this is going to be the books that I read in... I'm sorry about the Phantom of the Opera lighting, but there you go. What can we do? I'll just do the whole video like this. Hello. Yes, so this is going to be the books that I read in the past sort of 3 months-ish. So yes, let's get on with it. So the first book that I started in the year was not the first book that I finished by a long way, and that was... Ducks Newburyport by Lucy Ellmann. So from the front, this doesn't look like, it's like a normal book, but then you turn it to the side and... So yeah, this was kind of in my periphery since last year, because of course it was longlisted, then shortlisted for the Booker Prize. And out of all the books kind of shortlisted, it was the one that kind of stuck out to me. It's got a very interesting USP, this book. It's over 1,000 pages long, but it is comprised seemingly of, the majority of it is comprised of one sentence. It's a stream of consciousness novel. It's so it centers around an Ohioan woman. She's a mother of 4. She's a professional baker and pie maker. She bakes pies and cakes and stuff for a living. The majority of the book is her, well, all of the book is her continuous thoughts about various different things. So yeah, I bought this copy in November, and I sort of left it on my, bedside table, thinking that, okay, I'm going to devote the month of January to this book. And in my head, my thinking was, Anna Karenina last year, that was 800 pages. That took me about 3 weeks. This is 1,000 pages, so this will probably take me 4 weeks. And so I was really excited, and I was like, right, okay, January's sorted with reading. But then the new year happened, and various things were happening in my life, and various things were happening in the world, and I got January blues big time. But what I did wrong was, rather than say, okay, let's leave this book, I kind of forced myself to start reading it. I was thinking like, oh God, I've got to start reading this book. And that was a mistake because, I just wasn't in the right frame of mind. It was about 3 weeks into January and I'd only got about 300 pages in, and I was like, come on, Ben, you don't have to read a book if you don't want to. And it's not that I didn't want to, it was just the fact that I just wasn't in the right frame of mind. It is a challenge, this book. It's like that pretty much for 1,000 pages, sort of. We'll get into that. So yeah, I was like, there's no issue with putting the book aside and, just picking it up later, DNFing it, as they say in the business. So yeah, that's what I did. I ended up kind of reading it intermittently between all of the other books that I'm about to talk about. So yes, stay tuned for my final thoughts. So the first book that I started and then finished this year was Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi. So it's quite a difficult book to sort of describe the plot, but basically it centers around Ada, I think that's how you pronounce it, and she's born in Nigeria, and she is inhabited by several different spirits and deities of Igbo culture and spirituality. And these spirits, they kind of observe her. They kind of influence her a little bit, but mainly they just observe her. But yeah, she grows up. She moves to the States, and she goes to university. She ends up in this she ends up in this relationship with this guy who's quite possessive and a bit sort of bit horrible. And then she discovers that she has been sexually assaulted by this guy without her knowledge. And in the trauma of that, she calls out for help, and who should arrive but a singular spirit called Asugara. I think that's her name, Asugara. And this spirit kind kind of completely takes control over Adar and kind of tries to form her in her own image and makes her much more ruthless and toughens her up and really kind of hardens her up. Now, as I was reading this, I was a bit wary to start with. I was like, oh, I don't know if I like this or not. Just because I wasn't so sure about the way that she just lost complete autonomy over herself after this horrible thing that happened to her. It took me a couple of chapters, but then I did realise, the penny dropped with what was going on. I was like, ooh, actually that is really, really fascinating and really, really good. Often they say about people who've gone through trauma is that it's almost like the person shuts down and the body takes over, or like they cease to be present. But they kind of go on autopilot, and it's about getting through the days and stuff. And in this book, it's not that the body takes over; it's that this spirit takes over and causes her to sort of do some questionable actions, and kind of makes her take revenge out on other people who didn't have anything to do with it. It's really, really interesting. There's a point in the book. I was reading some of it on a train, and because the book talks about mental health a little bit, and there was a point where it really kind of took me by surprise, and I didn't burst into tears, but I started crying on the train reading this bit, and I was just like, ooh, gosh, because it talks about certain things about mental health, and it phrases it in a way that I was like, ooh, I haven't read this sort of thing being articulated in this sort of way, and I think this book kind of, another big thing about the book it talks about is gender, and it's written by a non-binary author, and the character of Adar, they sort of go through this transformation of trying to work out their identity. Just really, really fascinating things about all that. I just thought it was really, really fascinating. It's not a book for everyone. I mean, no book is for everyone, but yeah, I thought it was really, really fascinating and quite hard hitting, and very, very good. I recommend it. Look at my hair. I need a haircut. Next up, The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea by Mishima. Oh gosh, I hadn't read Mishima before. I knew that he was quite a big figure in 20th century Japanese literature. I only know the kind of basics about him, but basically he was a very sort of celebrated author. He was a playwright, he was an actor, he was a model, he was a bodybuilder, he was all these sorts of things, and had led this very kind of varied life. Unfortunately, he's known for having quite an infamous and quite horrific death. So I sort of knew a basic knowledge of all that, but I'd never read one of his books. I'm not going to talk about the plot too much because I think it benefited me from not knowing anything about what this book was about. I will just say that it is, it is quite, ultimately it is quite disturbing, and I was just like, oh gosh. So I know this is a Western thing, but it's sort of, it looks at that kind of Freudian, the son wanting to kill the father and shag the mother sort of thing. It reminded me a little bit, I know this is a bit of a trite comparison, but there's a British horror film called Eden Lake, which kind of features kind of sociopathic teenagers, and it kind of reminded me a little bit of that. I won't say what the ending is, but I was just like, I thought the ending I thought was really sad more than anything. it is disturbing, but I was really kind of like, oh, that's not very nice. I'm intrigued to read his other books now. Now I know what to expect. That it's going to be sort of that chilling, disturbing stuff. I'll know what to expect, but yeah, it was an interesting one. Next up, I read a play. I was wondering whether to include this, but I was like, well, I read it, so I'll include it. I read Fairview by Jackie Sibblies Drury. So this won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama last year. It had a very successful run on Broadway. and then it had a very sort of sold out run at the Young Vic in London. So yeah, I didn't get to see this, but all of my friends who did basically said this is like the most amazing thing that they've seen on stage. And on Twitter, I could see people were sort of talking about it. In particular, they were talking about a particular bit where there was some kind of audience participation or something, and this apparently kind of made some white people in particular quite angry or quite sort of rattled, you know. So I was like, I want to know. I want to know what it is. So, of course, a play is meant to be watched. It's not meant to be read, ideally. And this play is definitely meant to be watched, not read, because there's certain elements which require, what you see and what you hear are two different things, and you can't really experience that reading it. So I won't sort of go too much about what it's about, because it's just in case it's revived, But it starts out 3 acts. The first act is a seemingly kind of normal standard play featuring a black middle class family getting ready for the grandmother's birthday, and it's kind of clear that there's something going on because the language is very it's sort of very sort of stock dialogue and kind of like cliche lines, and kind of, if you go to the theatre a lot, then you'll sort of recognise there's sort of some tropes that happen. The second act, the same thing happens, although we hear something different. We hear a conversation being played over what we see, which is why it's not ideal to read it. You have to watch it. And then in the third act, these two things come together. So yeah, it's a play about race, and it's a play about how the white gaze kind of affects black people in particular, and how kind of damaging and how sort of limiting that is. The bit that people kind of got rattled by, I read it and I was like, ooh gosh. Particularly with British audiences, I was like, I wonder how. I mean, I'm not going to say what it was, but in my head I was thinking, like, I wonder how literally audiences took this, because a request is asked of the white people of the audience, and I kind of wondered how literally or rhetorically this was taken. So I did ask people who were there, and they said that it was taken literally, that a lot of white people did the thing that was asked of them. However, someone who did, I know someone who works at the theatre. I'm not going to lambast anyone or anything, but or libel anyone. But they did say that every performance that there were walkouts. There was that could be from 1 person to 20 people would walk out. There would often be heckling, apparently, and sometimes the actors themselves would kind of break character and heckle back. So it was quite a fraught atmosphere, apparently, unfortunately. So yeah, they said it was quite a tough production to work on, even though they supported it and everything. So yeah, it's a fascinating play to read, although it's much more ideal to watch it. I obviously, but I'm glad I read it because I enjoyed it. Next up, this book. It's Animal Farm by George Orwell, obviously. This is an odd book. This is an odd edition. It's a draw your own cover edition. And I've had this. It's kind of been around for years and years and years. I don't know where it's come from really, but at my parents' house, I don't know if anyone else has this, but at my parents' house there's a kind of like inconspicuous drawer in the spare room, and in this drawer there's just lots of stuff from my childhood and from being a teenager that they don't know what to do with, and I don't know what to do with, so it just sort of sits in this drawer forever and ever. I was sort of rummaging through, as I do from time to time, and I noticed that this book was there, and I was like, Animal Farm, ooh. Now I'm pretty sure I read this in secondary school, because I did know the plot, kind of. I mean, I knew what happened to Boxer, for example, and there were certain things that I knew. So I assumed I read it in secondary school. But it's good to kind of revisit it, particularly in a Trump era, I mean, I know that Trump and Stalin are, because this is kind of like a allegory for Stalin and Stalinism, and I know that Trump and Stalin are kind of like opposite ends of the tennis match, but no, just because of the sort of the fake news thing and the revisionism thing that happens within it, I thought it's an interesting book to kind of revisit. If you haven't read it like me in over 15 years since school or whatever, then do reread it, because I did find it interesting, and I got something from it. I haven't read 1984, and I do have that on I've got this big list of books that I want to read, particularly sort of classic books that I want to read this year. And 1984, it was kind of like way down the list, but I might bring it up and read it, because I did enjoy this book and the writing in it. So I'm going a little bit out of chronological order here, but the next book I'm going to talk about is this book, Queenie, by Candice Carty-Williams. A lot to talk about with this book. So occasionally in the book world, you hear about this sort of thing happening, whereby there'll be a debut novel. For whatever reason, it sets up a bidding war between publishers, and the winning publisher kind of gives out this massive 6-7 figure advance for the book, and that's what kind of happened with this. It's centered around Queenie, the eponymous Queenie, who is a black British woman, 25-year-old woman, and she has this kind of nice job. She's a journalist, and she works for a magazine, but she's going through quite a tumultuous period with her boyfriend, Tom, and they kind of decide to have a kind of a break. It's sort of unclear, to Queenie at least, whether this is a break or a breakup, but essentially they break up. She then starts to have quite a lot of hookups and sex with various different men, mainly kind of white guys, who are kind of treat her like trash, and her mental health starts to plummet. Her job starts to kind of unravel. Her friendships start to kind of go to pot, and it's basically how she copes with all this. So first of all, I mean, it's really, really well written. I've read this in like 3 days. It's very, very easy read. It's very entertaining. You get through it, and it's really, really good. So it deals with race as well. It deals with how she deals with being a black woman in London, predominantly in sort of white spaces. So be that at work, be that in relationships. Her boyfriend Tom is a white guy. And how she deals with racism from various different levels of racism, if that makes sense, from like petty microaggressions to being at a swimming pool, and to being fetishized. That's a big topic of the book, and also just straight up racism from the boyfriend's family. It's not what this book isn't is a like a state of things. This is the black woman's experience, and that's not what the book is. It's very, very singular. Queenie has very sort of specific flaws, and not everyone has these flaws. Yeah, she has a particular way of dealing with things, and for some people that makes her quite annoying. For me, I didn't have a problem with that. I mean, I think for me, flaws maketh plot, and I don't mind a character who keeps making the same mistake, because I make the same mistake. I mean, my flipping sex life. There was one part of the book which I was interested by. I'm just going to take some tea because I'm struggling here. Yeah, there was one part of the book. Queenie, she makes a point of not dating black guys, and she makes quite a sort of pointed point of not dating black guys, because of the way that she feels like they treat her as a black woman. From what I remember, there's 3 black male characters in the book. There's the granddad, there's the stepdad, who we sort of see in flashbacks, and there's one kind of young guy who she meets at a party, and this is kind of early in the book, and he kind of confirms this this idea she has about the way black men treat her. And for the rest of the book, her sexual conquests are mainly white guys. I mean, this probably would have been an obvious thing to have done, but I thought that she would have met, towards the end of the book, she'd meet, a young black guy, and he would kind of, challenge her preconceived ideas. But that doesn't happen. Although I guess she does learn her lesson from, expecting certain things from trash white guys. I was surprised that there wasn't that discussion that she has at the beginning of the book isn't kind of challenged or resolved. Not that she would like fall in love with anyone, but yeah, I was sort of interested in that. But yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. It's a really fun book. It's not subtle. It's not a subtle book, but that's fine. They are turning it. They're turning it into a TV show, and I believe Carty-Williams herself is helping to write it. Now, I don't like it. In modern times, every kind of female-led comedy drama sort of thing is referred to as being like the F word, if you know what I mean. And although this is nothing like the F word, I do think that if it's done right, and I'm sure it will be done right, I think this has the potential to have the same kind of cultural impact as, just because it is very, very what's the word, zeitgeisty, I guess, and yeah, very, very present with certain issues today. So yeah, do read it. I recommend it, definitely. Next, something completely different. I read Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. Now, this was the last of my kind of unknown Jane Austen novels. In terms of reading the novels, I still have Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility to read, but I do know what those plots are. And this book was, like, as I say, the last kind of like unknown plot that I had to read, because I didn't know anything about it. It's quite a convoluted backstory to explain the plot, but basically it centres around Fanny Price, who, when she is 10, she is taken from her own family. She has like 9 siblings and is living in quite sort of poverty-stricken circumstances. Her uncle and aunt, who are quite wealthy, they say to Fanny Price's mother, "Okay, we'll take one of your kids just to alleviate some of the financial burden of having 10 kids." And so they send Fanny Price. And so Fanny Price grows up with her cousins and her uncle and aunt. And she grows up to be sort of excruciatingly shy and very timid and nervous. You just have to talk to her and she starts to blush, and she's not mistreated, but she is definitely treated lesser than everyone else. She's kind of like a couple of steps up from being a servant, basically. She's not Cinderella, but she's kind of very undervalued. Except there's one cousin called Edmund who does sort of treat her with some shred of respect. So next door, a brother and sister arrive, Henry and I can't remember what her name is, Miss Crawford, and they're 2 very, very popular, very kind of like confident young people, and they're quite big flirts. They're big old flirts, Henry in particular. And Henry Crawford, he kind of works his way through the 2 sisters. He has this thing where he likes to make women fall in love with him. And Fanny Price, obviously, she sees what he's doing, and she's very, very moralistic, is our Fanny Price. And she sees what he's doing with them, and she's like, "Oh, I don't want anything to do with this guy." And then Henry Crawford, he kind of sees that Fanny Price doesn't really, that she doesn't want anything to do with him, and he sees it as a challenge, and he's like, "I will make Fanny Price fall in love with me." Inadvertently, he ends up falling in love with her for real. And the main kind of big dilemma of the book is whether Fanny will succumb to Henry Crawford's advances or not, or whether she'll stick to her guns and say, no, I know what he is like. I'm going to stick to my guns. With Jane Austen, you do know kind of what the end is going to be, but I just at a certain point I was like, I don't actually know what the end of this is going to be. There's this really, I mean, there's a really kind of heart-wrenching I'm disappointed in you, you've screwed up speech by the uncle, which I was like, oh gosh, no, justice for Fanny. But yeah, no, it's the second longest. It's nearly 500 pages. I don't think it's as long as Emma, but yeah, it's quite a slow burner. There's not much sort of big plot stuff. It's mainly about kind of the interior, kind of like, oh no, will I? Should I? No. But yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. I think the reason that there's not as many, because it's a brilliant book, but I think the reason that it's not kind of adapted as much as the others, I mean, partly because the end, I mean, I won't say what the end is, but the end, I think, is fairly unpalatable for modern audiences. I think if you did a faithful adaptation of it, I think at the end people would be like, ooh. But that's what happened in those times. And also because it is quite an interior. It's about what she's thinking mainly, and I think it's difficult to kind of to show that, because what she shows is quite kind of like, but what's going on is like, wah! So I think that's why it's not adapted as often as the others. But no, I really liked it. I think this is kind of one of my favourites that I've read so far. As I say, I still have Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility to read after this, and then I'll be done with reading Jane Austen, her finished novels. So there we go. Mansfield Park. I recommend it. Next up, another really, really good book, Circe by Madeline Miller. So Song of Achilles was my favourite book that I read last year by a long way. I loved it. So I was really keen to read her other book, Circe. And I spotted this in a charity shop, and I was like, ooh, I'll have it. She's such a good writer, Madeline Miller. I really like her. One of the interesting things about this book was it was released in 2018, kind of within like the Me Too movement. So it was quite sort of timely, this book. It's a big kind of like feminist reading you can do of the book, because it's centered around Circe. Now, Circe is quite a sort of lesser known figure from Greek mythology, but she does kind of turn up in various different myths. Yeah, one thing I thought about in Song of Achilles particularly is just how badly the women are treated. I mean, of course, it's the Trojan War and everything, but yeah, I mean, it's the same in all kind of periods of history, but particularly in sort of ancient Greece, being a woman, it was a rough deal. And certainly in the myths, there's kind of like really kind of grim things that they venerate, But yeah, I really liked it. She's a really, really good writer, is Madeline Miller. I watched an interview with her, and she said that, because I kind of want her to sort of carry on with this, but she said that this was probably the last one that she does of sort of Greek myth retellings. But I hope she does, at least at some point in her career. I hope she does at least another one of these, because I think she's really good at it, and yeah, she's becoming one of my favorite authors of recent times. Yeah, I really, really liked it. So I think now I'm going to talk about the non-fiction books that I read. I read 2 non-fiction books and sort of tried to read a third, but that didn't work. But the 2 that I did read were White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo and Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge. So these 2 books, they kind of talk about similar things, similar topics, but from 2 different perspectives and 2 different contexts. Namely about the difficulties that white people have about talking about race, and kind of why that's a problem. and how we can resolve it. So yeah, so White Fragility. So this is by Robin DiAngelo, and she is a white American academic. And so this book is basically talking about why it is white people can and very often do have a problem with talking about racism and race and kind of why that is. There's a few interesting things about the book. There was, I think, the most interesting thing that I took from it, she talks about how white people often see racism as kind of like a binary thing, like either you're a racist or you're not, you're a bad person or you're a good person. If you are kind of called up on it, on, you know, a microaggression or racism, it's suddenly like a huge kind of affront to your character, because it's like, well, I'm not a bad person, you know, I'm not a racist, you know. But her kind of argument is that racism is the structure in which we live. This sort of behaviour is kind of inevitable rather than, you know, good person, bad person. So I thought that was interesting. But then we have Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge. And so Reni Eddo-Lodge, she is a black British journalist and author. And so this book is kind of more from a British perspective. The title comes from a article that she wrote, I think it was in The Guardian, about why she's no longer talking to white people about race. And yeah, just going through her frustrations and her kind of the things that she's found, the kind of the pushback that she gets from white people when she's talking about this sort of stuff. It's not the book that you might think it is from the, it's not an attack or anything. It's a very kind of comprehensive look at race and attitudes towards race over a whole kind of, over lots and lots of different things. So there's a chapter on race and class, which is really interesting. There's a chapter about race and feminism. Just lots of different things. And because it's from a British perspective as well, we have a bit of a bad habit in this country of being a bit sanctimonious towards, you know, like towards America. You know, we sort of think of racism as more of a American problem, and so we sort of look down our noses. Oh yes, well, we don't have Charlottesville and we don't have Ferguson, and no one has to take a knee in our country. But of course, you know, that's not entirely true, and this book is all about that. So I would really recommend it. It's very, very yeah, I'd really recommend it. The other non-fiction book that I tried to read was this one, The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. I've started it, but I think you have to be in a really, really good, mental healthy, good, stable place to read this book, because it's about, it's basically the worst case scenario, climate change, but talking about the worst case scenario in terms of it's going to happen. So I think I'm going to read it eventually, but yeah, you just need to, because it's going to depress you. So I think you just need to be in a good place to do that. Hello. Future Ben is commandeering this video because I did the rest of the video with a cough drop in my mouth and it just wasn't ideal. So I just thought I'll just do it again. So hello, different t-shirt, different day. Hello. So another classic that I read was The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now this is a book that's always on the 100 books to read before you die lists. It is also on, I've seen it on a 40 books to read, I've seen it on 10 books to read. It's kind of really up there in terms of, you've got to read this book. So I did. I was surprised by the novel. It's no wonder that it's a huge, huge classic and very, very well revered and stuff. Yeah, there's some really, F. Scott Fitzgerald, I need to read another one of his books because he has a way of phrasing things that's, I kept having to like reread things. I was like, wow, that's an amazing way of phrasing something. I was really kind of impressed by it, and I did enjoy it. I thought the end was really sad. With the dad and everything. I think I need to read it again because I do have friends who are like, this is like my favourite novel ever. So I think I do need to read it again, but I'm glad I read it now, so I can tick it off the list at least. And yes, The Great Gatsby. So another big book from last year that I read was Girl, Woman, Other by Bernadine Evaristo. This won the Booker Prize, of course. It's 12 different characters, and they are all kind of connected, kind of in various different ways. They are mainly all women, well, mainly all cis women. There's one non-binary character. The book kind of looks at identity and womanhood and sort of trying to make a mark on the world. It's mainly set in London, but I think there's 3 characters who grew up on a farm in the north of England. So yes, I did really enjoy it. I really love the style of it. It's got an interesting. There's very limited punctuation, and so there's no full stops. So each sentence has its own paragraph. So even though it's quite thick, you get through it really quickly because there's lots of white space basically. I really liked the nuance of the book. There's a really good section about privilege and the kind of the nuances in that, and so I really appreciated that. And then also just looking at race and stuff, and yeah, I thought it was really fascinating. I also loved the way that a character will be in one person's story, a character will be really briefly mentioned, but then a couple of chapters later they'll have that person who was briefly mentioned will have a whole chapter dedicated to them. And so I love that kind of looking like behind everyone has a story basically. Even the really nasty teacher that you hated at school, they've got their own lives, of course. So I really like that about the novel. There was one bit, I've seen some criticism about the non-binary character, and reading it, I mean, obviously I'm cisgendered, so I don't really know a lot about it, but I didn't have too much of a problem. The thing that I was surprised by is that right at the end of the book, well, near the end of the book, there's one of the characters is revealed to have gender critical thinking, and she sets up this women's festival. She sets it up for women born women, which causes a big backlash, and the non-binary character, who is quite sort of famous on Twitter, kind of campaigns for it to be shut down. And at the end of the book there is this event where a lot of the characters are at the same place at the same time, and so I was surprised that there wasn't, not a face-off, but I was surprised that there wasn't kind of like a discussion between those two characters. Yeah, I was just surprised that wasn't looked at in more detail, because the rest of the book goes into lots and lots of detail. But apart from that, I really liked it. It won the Booker Prize, for goodness sake, and there's a reason why it won the Booker Prize. And yes, do read it. So yes, Girl, Woman, Other. Very, 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 very good. Speaking of the Booker Prize, the International Booker Prize long list has recently been released. Of all the books, one that really interested me was Hurricane Season. This is by Fernanda Melchor. So the premise of the book really interested me and sort of hooked me. So the premise is that the local witch of this Mexican town, she is found dead at the start of the novel. She's sort of been brutally murdered. And so the novel kind of looks at a handful of characters and their involvement, kind of directly or indirectly, in the witch's murder. So I was like, oh, I quite fancy that. Oh gosh. So this is a really tough read. This is about the very dark side of human nature. It's there's a really good sentence on the blurb. Fernanda Melchor paints a moving portrait of lives governed by poverty and violence, machismo and misogyny, superstition and prejudice. And the machismo and misogyny, that's a big thing of the book. Like, all the men are wanting to, sort of prove themselves to be manly and stuff, and they treat the women like garbage. There's a lot, to be warned, there's a lot of sexual violence in the book. And when I started to read it, I was like, I don't know whether I'm going to like it, but I stuck with it, and I'm glad I did, because it's good to challenge yourself, obviously, but also it's good to reflect and to explore the darker sides of our humanity. And there's some really barbaric horrible stuff that happens in the book, particularly to women. I'm glad I read it. Towards the end, there's some really, I really liked, it's like some sort of a little peppering of supernatural horror, and I really liked that. I'm not a horror fan or anything, but I liked it in this book. Oh, the style of it, it reminded me of Milkman by Anna Burns, just because I mean, it's like big blocks of text. In style, it's quite circuitous, then it goes off on tangents a lot. And so that reminded me of Milkman. I had a bit of a problem with Milkman last year. I struggled with this as well, just because of the content, but no, apart from that, I would recommend it, with a caveat of be careful. So here we go, we've reached the end, and we're back with Ducks Newburyport. Right, so at this point, having read all the other books and read this book intermittently, I'd got to about page 750, and I thought, 200. I can handle 250 pages, so I read the rest of it. I ended up, I mean, this is quite a beaten up copy now, but I ended up really liking this. Maybe going so far to say it's a masterpiece. Yeah, I mean, I've been on a big old journey with this book. It is a slog. Some people have talked about this book, that they were hooked like all the way through, and they didn't find it a slog at all. I did find it a slog, but that's because, obviously I did read it kind of in little bits. So maybe the next time I read it, I'll commit to it and read it, cover to cover, not in a single sitting. It's kind of a book about motherhood, really, at the crux of it, and the worries and the sort of fears about motherhood in today's world, in the Western world. I was kind of, because there's no real plot. It kind of just goes on and on and on. There's little pockets of respite. It goes to, it's really weird to describe this book without it sounding bonkers, but there's a mountain lion plot, a mountain lion and her cubs, and she loses her cubs, and she sort of goes on this big search to find her cubs again, and that's kind of told in kind of like normal prose, and it's sort of like little breathing spaces every kind of 100 pages or so in the novel. But yeah, I was reading it, I was thinking, because there's not much plot, it just talks about her thoughts and stuff about motherhood, and there's a really moving bit where she talks about her own mother who died of an illness, and all the way through she says this illness broke her, and she has big regrets about the way she treated her mum and stuff. She has big regrets about how she's treating her own daughter, and so it kind of, yeah, I really like that. I was sort of reading, I was thinking, what is the end of this book going to be? Like, I was just like, is it just going to peter out? I don't know. Turns out I won't say, but near the end is really dramatic. It's kind of out of the blue, but at the same time, it's not out of the blue, because it's the sort of thing that's been discussed like all the way through the book. And then suddenly, sort of right at the end, she has to deal with it herself. And then there's like about 50 pages of aftermath, and it was just so, it was so kind of powerful, I think, particularly when she talks about her daughter in the last line, and I was just like, wow, that is fabulous, because it's seemingly one big old sentence, and so I knew that at the end there would be a full stop, and yeah, Lucy Ellmann she did it. Yeah, I would really, really recommend you read this book if you can, because it's a big old read. So there we have it. There's my the books that I read for this winter. I don't know whether I'm going to carry on doing this. Because I don't know whether I want to commit to being a proper booktuber, but if I do, I do. If I don't, I don't. But other than that, I hope you are all okay. Take care of yourselves. I shall endeavour to take care of myself. And yes, if I do one of these again, I shall see you anon. Bye-bye.